The courtroom was unusually crowded that morning. People whispered to one another as they tried to find a seat. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of families, neighbors, and reporters who had come to witness something important. Outside, the sun was shining, but inside the walls felt heavy with seriousness. Everyone knew this case mattered, and the air carried a mixture of curiosity, tension, and quiet hope. At the very center of all this sat a little girl, no more than 9 years old. She was small, with tightly braided hair that had been carefully prepared by her grandmother that morning. She wore a simple yellow dress, the kind that looked like it had been saved for special occasions. Her hands held on tightly to a small stuffed toy, a faded bear whose fur had worn thin with love. That bear was her comfort, her little secret shield against the big world around her. She sat beside her grandmother, who patted her hand every so often. The grandmother's face was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of many years and many struggles. She whispered now and then into the girl's ear, little words of reassurance. "You're brave. Just be yourself," she said softly. The girl nodded, though her small feet swung nervously above the floor. The case had drawn people from all over town. The front rows were filled with reporters holding notepads, pens, and even cameras. Their eyes moved constantly, trying to catch every detail. Some whispered about the seriousness of the trial. Others scribbled down what they expected might be tomorrow's headline. But for now, the real attention was on the judge, who sat tall and serious at the front of the room. The judge was an older man with kind but firm eyes. His robe fell neatly over his shoulders, and his voice, though calm, carried weight every time he spoke. He looked over the room and reminded everyone of the importance of truth, fairness, and respect. Then his gaze fell on the little girl sitting quietly by her grandmother's side. No one had expected her to play an important role in this trial. To most, she was simply a child, too young to understand the seriousness of what was happening. But those who knew her best understood that she had seen more than a child ever should, and she carried with her a simple kind of honesty that adults often lose. As names were called, lawyers shuffled through papers, adjusting their suits and straightening their ties. The police officer at the center of the case sat across the room, his uniform replaced with a plain dark suit. His hands were folded, his face tight, and he avoided the curious stares of the crowd. His presence alone reminded everyone why the room was full, because truth needed to be spoken, and justice needed to be weighed. The atmosphere grew thicker as the trial moved forward. Witness after witness stepped up to the stand, each one answering questions carefully, some nervously, others confidently. Their voices blended into the steady rhythm of the courtroom, but nothing they said seemed to lift the tension that lingered in the air. People shifted in their seats, waiting for something to happen, something that might change the direction of the case. Then the moment came. The judge cleared his throat and spoke the little girl's name. A hush fell over the room. At first, it seemed almost unbelievable. Why call upon someone so young? Whispers filled the corners of the courtroom as heads turned toward her. Her grandmother gave her hand a final squeeze, leaned down, and whispered, "It's all right, baby. Just tell the truth." The girl's eyes widened, and for a brief second, she seemed frozen. She looked at the floor, then at her grandmother, and finally at the bear she clutched in her hands. With a deep breath, she slid off the bench, her small shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor as she began the long walk to the front of the room. Every step felt heavy. The benches on either side seemed taller, the faces staring at her seemed endless. She walked past reporters who stopped writing just to watch. She walked past strangers whose eyes followed her every move. Her little heart beat faster and faster, yet her face showed a kind of quiet determination. When she reached the front, the judge leaned forward kindly, his tone softer now than before. He asked if she was ready to speak, if she understood why she was there. The little girl nodded. She held her bear a little tighter, as though it carried her strength. Her voice was soft when she spoke, but it was clear enough for everyone to hear. At that very moment, the room grew so silent you could almost hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Reporters lowered their pens. The lawyers turned their heads. Even the police officer raised his eyes for a brief second. Nobody breathed too loudly. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. The child's gaze wandered across the room. Her eyes scanned the faces until they landed on the man in the dark suit, the officer. She didn't look away. Instead, with a surprising steadiness for someone so small, she raised her hand and pointed directly at him. Gasps filled the air. Some people leaned forward. Others covered their mouths in shock. The judge blinked and then leaned back slightly in his chair. The lawyers exchanged glances, both sides realizing that this was no ordinary moment. And yet, the little girl stood there quietly, her arm stretched out, her hand pointing firmly. She didn't tremble. She didn't frown. She simply did what her heart told her was right. The innocence in her eyes carried more weight than any thick stack of papers or legal arguments. Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she watched her granddaughter's courage unfold. She whispered something softly, though no one around her could quite hear it. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was gratitude. Whatever it was, it seemed to wrap the little girl in invisible strength. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze in that moment, as though time itself had paused. No one expected a child's presence to hold so much power, but here she was, tiny, brave, and unshaken. Her small gesture carried the weight of truth, and everyone felt it. The judge broke the silence with a gentle nod, encouraging her to continue. But even before she spoke a word, everyone knew the story had already shifted. Something important had happened, something that would not be forgotten. The little girl lowered her hand slowly, holding her bear close to her chest again. Her voice was still waiting to be heard, but already she had done what no one else could. She had turned a courtroom filled with arguments and tension into a place where innocence and courage spoke louder than anything else. And so, in that quiet, waiting moment, all eyes remained fixed on her. They were no longer just watching a trial. They were witnessing the start of something that might change everything. The little girl stood at the front of the courtroom, her small frame barely reaching the top of the witness chair. The judge spoke softly to her, making sure she understood she was safe. He explained that she only needed to tell the truth, nothing more and nothing less. She nodded politely, though her hands still clutched the worn stuffed bear she had carried with her since the morning. She took her seat, her legs too short to reach the floor, so they swung nervously back and forth. The sound of her shoes lightly tapping against the wooden chair filled the silence. The whole courtroom remained still. Reporters leaned forward with pens ready, waiting for every word. The jury looked on with gentle curiosity, some with kind eyes, others with cautious interest. Her grandmother sat only a few feet away, close enough that the girl could see her comforting smile. Each time she glanced at her grandmother, she seemed to find a little more courage. That smile reminded her that she wasn't alone in this big, serious place. The lawyer approached slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. His voice was calm, almost like a teacher speaking to a child. He asked her name, her age, and a few simple questions to make her feel at ease. She answered in a soft but clear voice, every word making the crowd lean in just a little more. Then came the question everyone had been waiting for. The lawyer gently asked her about the day she had seen the police officer. He didn't rush her. He didn't push. He simply gave her space, allowing her to share what she remembered. The girl hesitated at first. She looked down at her bear, stroking its ear with her thumb. For a moment, it seemed she might stay silent. But then she lifted her head and turned her gaze toward the officer sitting across the room. Her eyes locked onto him, steady and sure. In that instant, the courtroom grew even quieter. You could almost hear people holding their breath. It was as if the whole building leaned forward, waiting to hear what this little girl would say. She lifted her small hand again and pointed at him. The movement was slow but deliberate. There was no doubt in her action. The officer shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his tie, but he didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of him. The girl's voice was gentle, yet it carried across the room. She spoke not like an adult rehearsing lines but like a child simply telling what she knew. Her words were simple, her sentences short, but the meaning behind them was powerful. She described what she saw that day. She spoke about where she was standing, what she noticed, and how it made her feel. She didn't use complicated details. She didn't try to explain things in the way adults do. Instead, her honesty was as clear as sunlight. Everyone could picture the moment through her small, trembling words. The innocence in her voice made the truth undeniable. A few people in the audience lowered their heads. Some pressed tissues to their eyes. Even the jury shifted in their seats, visibly touched by her courage. The lawyers listened carefully, their pens frozen mid-scribble, as if they didn't want to miss even a single syllable. The judge leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes showed the weight of the moment. He was no longer just listening to a witness, he was witnessing something extraordinary, a child's truth breaking through the complicated walls of a courtroom. The little girl paused for a moment, her voice fading into silence. She looked around nervously, as if to check whether she had done the right thing. Her grandmother gave her a small nod, and the girl took another deep breath. She continued, her words a little stronger now. She didn't raise her voice, but there was strength in the way she spoke. Each word was like a small pebble dropping into a still pond, sending ripples across the room. The officer shifted again, this time glancing up for a brief moment before lowering his gaze once more. His hands tightened together, his knuckles pale against the dark suit he wore. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across paper. Camera shutters clicked quietly, capturing the expression of a child who carried the weight of truth on her shoulders. For a moment, it felt as though the adults in the room had become children again, reminded of how powerful honesty could be when spoken without fear. The girl's voice trembled near the end of her story. She pressed the bear closer to her chest, her small fingers gripping it tightly. She finished her sentence and then stopped, her eyes glancing toward the judge as though asking silently if she had said enough. The lawyer gave her a gentle smile and said, "You did very well." The judge nodded too, his expression softening. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale at once, as if everyone had been holding their breath through her testimony. The girl looked down at her shoes, swinging them once again beneath the chair. She didn't fully understand the impact of what she had just done. To her, she had only spoken the truth, the way her grandmother had told her to. But to the people watching, she had done something far greater. She had brought light into a room that had been filled with shadows of doubt and fear. For a moment, silence lingered. No one dared to speak right away. The weight of her words hung in the air, touching each person differently. Some felt sadness, others felt hope, and many felt a deep respect for the bravery of a child who had stood taller than most adults ever could. The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But everyone noticed how he avoided the little girl's eyes. It was as though he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze, as though her innocence had revealed something that no amount of legal defense could hide. The jury sat quietly, their faces thoughtful, their minds clearly working to absorb what they had just heard. They knew this was more than just another testimony. It was the kind of moment that could change the course of a case, the kind of moment that would be remembered long after the trial ended. The grandmother wiped a tear from her cheek, though she kept smiling proudly. She whispered another prayer under her breath, grateful that her granddaughter had found the courage to speak. The little girl looked back at her, her lips curving into the faintest smile. In that exchange of glances, strength was passed from one generation to another. The judge finally cleared his throat, breaking the silence. He thanked the child for her honesty, his tone unusually warm for such a serious setting. He reminded the courtroom that the words of even the youngest among us carry weight, because truth does not depend on age or size. The little girl nodded politely. She didn't fully grasp the meaning of the judge's words, but she understood one thing clearly: she had done her part. She had spoken the truth, and that was all anyone had asked of her. As she stepped down from the witness stand, her small shoes tapping once again against the wooden floor, the courtroom remained unusually still. Every eye followed her as she walked back to her grandmother. She climbed onto the bench and nestled into her grandmother's side, hugging her bear tightly. The grandmother wrapped an arm around her, whispering, "I'm proud of you, baby." The girl leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder, finally letting out a small sigh of relief. She was safe again, surrounded by the love that had carried her into that room in the first place. But the echoes of her testimony remained. Though she sat quietly now, her words continued to move through the courtroom, stirring thoughts, emotions, and questions. It was clear to everyone that the trial had taken a turn. The simple voice of a little girl had shifted the weight of the entire case, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The little girl sat in the big chair, her small hands gripping the stuffed bear against her chest. Her eyes shifted around the courtroom for a moment before returning to the officer in the dark suit. Her voice was gentle, soft, but it reached every corner of the room. Each person leaned in closer, straining to hear every word. She began slowly, choosing her words carefully, like stepping on stones across a river. She told the court where she had been that day. She explained in her own simple way what she had seen and how it made her feel. Her sentences were short and honest, with no fancy details, no complicated language, just the truth as only a child could describe it. At first, her voice trembled slightly, but with every sentence she grew stronger. She didn't look down or hide. Instead, she kept her eyes steady, as though something inside her knew this was too important to shy away from. Her innocence gave her strength. She wasn't trying to convince anyone or win an argument. She was simply telling what was real. The effect was powerful. People in the gallery grew quiet, some clasping their hands together, others leaning forward with wide eyes. The reporters who had been scribbling notes furiously now slowed down, as if even they wanted to listen more than write. The jurors exchanged glances, their faces showing how deeply her words were settling into their minds. The officer sat stiffly at his table, his shoulders tight, his gaze fixed firmly downward. He didn't move much, only shifting slightly in his chair now and then. But anyone watching closely could see that his jaw tightened with every word that came from the girl's lips. She spoke of small things that might have seemed unimportant to adults, but in her story, they became important. She described the way she had felt, the fear in her heart, the way the air seemed heavy around her that day. She recalled details in the way children often do, honest, direct, and unshaped by the careful words adults sometimes use. Her story was not dressed up or softened. It was just her truth, spoken with the kind of clarity that only a child could bring. As her words continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The air no longer felt like it belonged to lawyers or judges. It belonged to her. She held the room in her small hands, not by force but by the natural weight of truth. The judge leaned forward, listening more carefully than he had to any other witness. The lawyers sat silently, their pens still, their faces serious. The girl paused now and then, hugging her bear tighter, almost as if she needed to gather her strength. Each time she stopped, the silence grew so heavy that people could hear their own breathing. Then, when she spoke again, her voice seemed even clearer. There was no anger in her tone, no attempt to accuse or insult. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here because she had been asked to tell the truth, and she had promised her grandmother she would. And in that promise, she carried herself with dignity far beyond her age. At one point, her words caused a stir in the crowd. Gasps rippled across the room, followed by a hush so deep it was almost sacred. Her statement was so simple, yet so direct, that it pierced through layers of doubt. People shifted uncomfortably on the benches, realizing they had just witnessed a moment that would stay with them long after they left the courtroom. A juror reached for a tissue, dabbing at her eyes quietly. Another leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as though trying to shield himself from the weight of her truth. Even the clerk, who had spent years recording testimonies without showing emotion, looked down for a moment, as though hiding the feelings her words had stirred. The girl glanced once more at the officer. She didn't speak with hate, she spoke with honesty. Her eyes were steady, her hand pointing once more as if to remind everyone that what she said was not a story or a guess, it was what she had seen with her own eyes. Her innocence made it undeniable. The defense lawyer cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, clearly uneasy. He had planned questions, strategies, arguments, but against the pure honesty of a child, his tools seemed weak. How could he twist or challenge words that were so simple, so straightforward, and so free of malice? The judge let her finish at her own pace. There was no rush. Time itself seemed to bend around her, slowing to match the rhythm of her voice. When she finally finished, the room remained still, as if no one dared to break the spell her testimony had cast. The silence stretched long, heavy with meaning. It was the kind of silence that makes people reflect, that makes them see things differently. The girl lowered her hand slowly, resting it back on her bear. She didn't look proud or triumphant. She just looked relieved, as though a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. Her grandmother wiped her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief, whispering something under her breath. Perhaps it was thanks, perhaps it was a prayer. Whatever it was, it seemed to surround the little girl with even more strength. The judge finally spoke, his voice softer than before. He thanked the child for her bravery. His words were careful, respectful, acknowledging that what she had done was not easy. The courtroom seemed to agree, though no one clapped or cheered. The quiet nods, the softened eyes, and the hushed whispers showed that her testimony had touched everyone. The officer still avoided her gaze. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his lips pressed into a thin line. The contrast between his silence and her honesty was clear to everyone watching. No matter what arguments would come later, no matter what evidence was yet to be shown, the voice of the little girl had left a mark that could not be erased. The jury, too, seemed changed. Their expressions carried the weight of her story, as though they had been given something precious to hold. They knew her words would echo in their minds when the time came to make decisions. The lawyer who had called her to the stand finally said, "No more questions, Your Honor." His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed a quiet awe at the power of what had just happened. The judge gave the child a kind smile. "You may step down," he said gently. She nodded, sliding off the chair. Her shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor as she walked back to her grandmother. The courtroom followed her with their eyes, their hearts heavy yet strangely uplifted. She climbed onto the bench again, curling close to her grandmother, who wrapped an arm protectively around her. For the first time that day, the girl allowed herself a small smile, her cheek pressed against her grandmother's shoulder. Though she thought her part was finished, the echoes of her words remained in the room. They floated above the heads of the jury, settled on the judge's desk, and lingered in the corners where reporters sat with wide eyes. The truth of a child had been spoken, and it had changed everything. It was not just the words she said, but the way she said them, with innocence, with courage, and with no desire except to tell what she knew. That was what stunned the courtroom. That was what moved even the hardest hearts. And that was what no one would forget. The little girl had finished speaking, and though her words had ended, the silence she left behind still filled the entire courtroom. It was not an ordinary silence. It was heavy, meaningful, and almost sacred. Every person present felt it. No one could deny the weight of what had just happened. The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful, his fingers resting gently against his chin. For a long moment, he didn't move, as though he wanted to let the air settle before continuing. Even he, a man who had heard countless testimonies over the years, seemed deeply touched by the child's courage. Reporters, who usually whispered to one another between testimonies, remained still, their pens hovering above paper, not yet ready to move. Some had to blink away tears, surprised at themselves. They were used to recording facts, numbers, and statements, but this was different. This was not just a fact to write down, it was a moment to remember. Members of the jury shifted in their seats. One juror clasped her hands tightly together, as though holding onto strength. Another leaned back, rubbing his forehead, clearly moved by the honesty he had just heard. Their faces revealed emotions they had tried so hard to hide since the trial began. The little girl had returned to her grandmother's side, and there she sat quietly, hugging her bear, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not realize the impact she had made. To her, she had simply told the truth, just as her grandmother had asked her to. But the rest of the room felt something more. They felt that they had witnessed a moment of pure courage that might never be repeated. The officer at the center of the case sat motionless. His eyes stared down at the polished wooden table before him. His lips were pressed together tightly, and though his body remained still, his jaw muscles tensed and released, betraying the storm inside him. He could not bring himself to look at the child. His silence was louder than words, and everyone noticed it. The prosecutor stood slowly, adjusting his papers, though his voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Your Honor, the testimony of the witness is complete," he said carefully, his eyes glancing at the jury as if to remind them of the importance of what they had just heard. The defense lawyer rose next, his movements slower than usual. He adjusted his glasses, his expression heavy. Normally, he would ask a series of questions to challenge the witness, but now he hesitated. How could he argue against a child's innocent truth? How could he appear firm without seeming cruel? For once, he had no strong words to offer. After a long pause, he finally said quietly, "No questions, Your Honor." That simple statement caused a stir. The audience shifted, whispering to one another in surprise. The reporters scribbled again, recognizing how unusual it was for a lawyer to step back without a single question. It was as if even he knew that nothing he said could undo the power of what the girl had spoken. The judge nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying respect. "The testimony will remain on record." His tone held more warmth than usual, as though he too wanted to honor the courage of the child. The courtroom relaxed slightly, though the atmosphere remained emotional. People whispered quietly, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. It was rare, they realized, for such a small voice to carry such weight. One older man sitting in the back row whispered to his neighbor, "I've never seen anything like that in all my years." His neighbor nodded, still staring at the child with admiration. "She's braver than most adults I know," he replied softly. The grandmother stroked her granddaughter's hair gently, whispering words only the little girl could hear. The girl leaned into her embrace, her tiny shoulders finally relaxing now that her part was done. She had walked into that courtroom nervous and unsure, but she had walked back with quiet strength. For the rest of the day, the trial continued with other witnesses, other testimonies, and long arguments from lawyers. But no matter who spoke, the memory of the little girl's words hovered in the room. Each new voice seemed smaller compared to hers. Each argument seemed weaker. The jurors listened, but their expressions showed that their hearts were still thinking about the child. Even when the court recessed for a short break, people gathered in small groups, whispering about her. Some spoke about her bravery, others about the way her simple words had carried so much truth. The reporters gathered outside the courthouse, their conversations filled with the same topic. "The child's testimony," one said, "will be the headline. There's no question." Back inside, When the trial resumed, the defense tried to regain ground. The lawyer spoke firmly, presenting documents and evidence, but the jury listened with polite detachment. It was as if the truth already lived in their minds, and nothing could erase it. The officer remained quiet throughout, his posture stiff, his eyes rarely leaving the table. He knew, as did everyone else, that the child's words had left an impression too deep to ignore. His silence only made the contrast clearer, the innocence of a child versus the guardedness of an adult. As the day came to an end, the judge reminded everyone of their duty. His words carried authority, but there was also a softness in his tone, perhaps influenced by what he too had felt from the child's bravery. The jurors were instructed to think carefully, to weigh everything they had heard, but in their minds, they already knew which voice would echo the loudest. When the courtroom finally emptied, people filed out slowly, still speaking in hushed tones. Reporters hurried to send out their stories, their headlines already forming: child witness stuns courtroom, little girl's words shift trial. The world outside would soon know what had taken place within those walls. But inside the quiet of the courthouse, as the benches emptied and the echo of footsteps faded, one image remained strong: the sight of a little girl pointing her small hand at a powerful figure, her voice steady, her truth unshaken. That moment became the heart of the trial. That moment was what people would remember years later. And though the outcome of the case was still uncertain, one thing was already clear: the courage of a child had forever changed the way everyone saw the truth. Her grandmother held her close as they walked out of the courtroom together, hand in hand. The girl looked up at her, her eyes tired but calm. "Did I do good?" she asked softly. Her grandmother smiled warmly, her eyes shining. "You did more than good," she whispered. "You did something people will never forget." The little girl didn't fully understand what that meant, but she felt the love and pride in her grandmother's words. She hugged her bear tightly and leaned against her grandmother's side as they stepped out into the evening light. Behind them, the courthouse stood tall and silent, holding within its walls the echoes of a voice that had changed everything. The trial moved forward in the days that followed, but the memory of the little girl's voice never left the courtroom. Her words seemed to linger in the air long after she had stepped down from the witness stand. Even when other witnesses came forward, even when lawyers argued back and forth, it was her quiet honesty that stayed in people's hearts. The jurors sat through every session, listening carefully, but their faces showed something had changed in them. The image of a small child pointing her hand with steady courage had already shaped the way they saw everything else. They weighed the evidence, they heard the arguments, but deep inside they knew they had been touched by something that could not be explained away. Reporters wrote about the trial every evening. Their articles carried headlines about the bravery of a 9-year-old girl who had spoken the truth when so many adults had hesitated. Her face never appeared in photographs, to protect her privacy, but her story spread quickly. People in the community began to talk about her courage. Some said she reminded them of their own children or grandchildren. Others said her voice had given them hope at a time when they felt powerless. Inside the courtroom, her presence lingered like sunlight breaking through clouds. The judge, though he continued his work with the seriousness of his office, often paused longer than usual when addressing the jury. It was as though even he was still carrying the weight of what she had said. His words seemed gentler, more thoughtful, as if he too had been reminded of the power of innocence. The officer remained quiet throughout, his eyes often lowered, his hands folded tightly in front of him. His silence was noticed by all, and the contrast between his guardedness and the child's openness grew clearer with each passing day. The defense lawyers did their best, presenting documents, calling witnesses, and making their arguments. But no matter what they brought forward, the jury's expressions suggested that they still carried the sound of the little girl's voice in their hearts. When the time finally came for closing arguments, both sides spoke at length. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the testimony, pointing gently to the moment that had touched everyone. He didn't need to exaggerate or raise his voice. He simply reminded them of the truth they had all witnessed through the words of a child. The defense lawyer tried to offer reasons, explanations, and doubt, but his arguments felt smaller now, as though they were being measured against something far greater. At last, the jury left the courtroom to make their decision. The hours that followed were long and heavy. People waited outside in the hallway, whispering nervously, pacing back and forth. Reporters tapped at their keyboards, preparing drafts of stories they might soon publish. Family members held hands, prayed quietly, or simply sat in silence, their faces tired but hopeful. The little girl sat with her grandmother in a quiet corner, her bear resting on her lap. She did not fully understand what the jury was deciding, but she sensed the seriousness of it. Her grandmother kept stroking her hair, whispering now and then, "You did your part. Whatever happens now, you did what was right." The girl leaned against her, comforted by the familiar warmth of her presence. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled once again. People rushed back to their seats, the air buzzing with anticipation. The judge called the court to order, his gavel striking softly, and asked the jury for their decision. The foreperson stood, holding the piece of paper that carried their verdict. His voice was steady but carried emotion. He read the words, and with each syllable, the room felt the weight of justice being decided. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by a wave of whispers, and then silence again. The verdict was clear. Justice had been served. The prosecutor bowed his head slightly, his lips moving in what seemed like a quiet prayer of thanks. The defense lawyer sighed, his shoulders dropping as though he had known this outcome was inevitable. The officer sat back heavily in his chair, his eyes still avoiding the gaze of anyone around him. But all eyes soon turned, not to the lawyers, not to the officer, but to the little girl sitting quietly with her grandmother. She hadn't spoken since her testimony, yet everyone knew she had been the one to change the course of the trial. Her courage had lit a path where there had been darkness. The grandmother hugged her tightly, whispering, "You see? The truth always shines." The girl smiled faintly, still not fully grasping how much she had done. To her, it had only been words, the truth she had promised to speak. But to everyone else, it had been a voice strong enough to move hearts and shift the scales of justice. As the courtroom emptied, people stopped to glance at her. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered softly, "That little one is a hero." Reporters, though unable to speak to her directly, wrote stories that praised her bravery and reminded the public that sometimes the smallest voices are the ones that carry the greatest power. Outside the courthouse, the evening sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and pink. The grandmother held the little girl's hand as they stepped onto the stone steps. The crowd outside parted slightly, giving them room to pass. Some people smiled warmly at her, while others simply bowed their heads in quiet respect. The girl clutched her bear and looked up at the wide sky. She felt lighter now, as though a burden she had carried for weeks had been lifted. She didn't know what people would write about her, she didn't know that her name would be whispered far beyond her town. All she knew was that she had told the truth, and her grandmother was proud of her. That was enough. In the days that followed, the story spread even further. Newspapers across the state carried headlines about her courage. Radio stations spoke of her testimony. People in other towns talked about the little girl who had stunned a courtroom with her honesty. Her face was never shown, her name kept private, but her story lived on. Teachers shared it with their students, reminding them that truth is powerful, no matter how small the voice that carries it. Parents told their children about her, using her story as a lesson in courage. Even strangers who had never met her felt inspired, as though her bravery had touched something deep inside them. The little girl returned to her everyday life. She went back to school, played with friends, and helped her grandmother with chores at home. She did not act like a hero, nor did she seek attention. To her, it had only been one moment, one promise she had kept. But the world around her continued to see her as a symbol of honesty and courage. Her grandmother often reminded her of that day, not to burden her, but to teach her. "Never forget," she would say gently, "that your voice matters. Even when you think no one will listen, the truth always finds its way." The girl would nod, hugging her bear, and smile. She didn't always understand the full meaning of her grandmother's words, but she carried them in her heart. She carried them the same way she had carried her truth into the courtroom. And so the story of the little girl became more than just part of one trial. It became a reminder to everyone that sometimes, the bravest voice is not the loudest, but the most honest. It became proof that even the smallest among us can stand tall when it matters most. Years later, people would still remember that day in the courthouse, the day a child pointed at a man in a dark suit and spoke words that stunned everyone. They would remember the silence that followed, the tears in the juror's eyes, the look of pride on her grandmother's face. They would remember that justice, in that moment, had been carried forward by the pure heart of a little girl. And long after the courthouse doors had closed, long after the headlines had faded, her story remained a quiet but powerful reminder that truth has no age, and courage can come from the most unexpected places.